In this nugget, we are going to discuss and go through some. Normally, if somebody talked to me about trickery and manipulation, I'd be saying, oh, that's awful. I don't want to hear about that. However, that's a big part of what the NetScaler is doing for us. Let me explain. Let's take a typical user, and let's say that user is Bob. So Bob's a happy camper on the internet somewhere. And let's say that Bob has an IP address of 100.4.4.25. And in fact, whatever that is, and he types in www.acme.com. Now, behind the scenes on Bob's computer, what happens is when he types in www.acme.com, his computer says, oh, I have no clue what IP address that is, but I have been given a DNS server to use. It does a DNS request, which is answered by a DNS server or set of DNS servers that got that information. And let's say that acme.com resolves to the IP address of 23.1.2.3. So then, in just milliseconds, Bob's computer then forms a TCP request that goes out to the 23.1.2.3 sourced from his 100.4.4.25, or at least as it goes to the last NAT device at Bob's company, it appears as if it's coming from 100.4.4.25. Now, for the sake of discussion, let's presume that this NetScaler, or this firewall, and all of these devices are the proud property of acme.com, or the data center that's managing it for acme.com. And so what happens is Bob's packet is sent in the direction of that IP address where the internet believes that lives, the 23.1.2.3. So here's where some of the trickery starts on the NetScaler. What we would do is we would configure this NetScaler, and we'll be doing this in our subsequent nuggets. We'll configure the NetScaler to act as a virtual server. To think for a moment, what would be, in our topology, in our example, what would be the perfect virtual IP address to associate with this virtual server for acme.com that's running on this NetScaler? And if you're thinking, well, Keith, if Bob thinks that 23.1.2.3 is acme.com, it's very likely that we're going to want to use that same IP of 23.1.2.3 and have it associated with that virtual server. And indeed we do. So on the NetScaler, we'll create a virtual server and assign it the virtual IP address of 23.1.2.3. So then as Bob's packets go to that NetScaler, and we'll allow that packet in through the additional trickery that our NetScaler is going to be doing. The NetScaler may be associated with one or more servers that it can handle that request. And that is indeed one of the many benefits of load balancing. We can have a whole bank, a whole farm of servers that could potentially respond to Bob's request. And so it's very likely in that case that on the NetScaler, we've also configured a subnet IP, and the acronym for that is the SNIP, the subnet IP. And we can have multiple subnet IPs. And as a common practice, if we had 3 separate interfaces going to individual network segments, and this was subnet A, and this was subnet B, and this was subnet C, on the NetScaler, we'd very likely configure 3 subnet IPs. One for subnet A, one for subnet B, one for subnet C. In our topology here, we're just going to have one interface, and the subnet IP, let's go right here. So the NetScaler is the owner, the proud owner of lots of addresses. It has the NetScaler IP, that's the base management address. It's going to have one or more subnet IPs. And in our case, we just configured the one that ended in .226. And it's also going to have a virtual IP and probably multiple virtual IPs, one for every virtual server that's been created on the NetScaler. So our VIP in this topology, the virtual IP is going to be that 23.1.2.3, which Bob thinks belongs to acme.com. And that's where Bob's packet is headed to. So let's you and I continue on with the magic that the NetScaler is going to do for us. This request for HTTP services, the NetScaler has 3 choices. It could do load balancing based on round robin, the least busiest server, or the type of client that was making the request. There's just a boatload of choices that we have. For a web page. What's going to happen is this NetScaler is acting as a TCP proxy. So when Bob's request came in to the NetScaler, to the virtual IP, the NetScaler is going to turn around and build its own session, or possibly use an existing session to one of its servers. Address after it goes through the NetScaler on its way to server number 1 is going to be 192.168.1.226. And I'll write here that that is the SNIP, the subnet IP address on the NetScaler. And the destination IP address is going to be the destination IP address of server number 1, which is 192.168.1.1 in this topology. So when people see this for the first time, and they think, wait a second, it's actually changing the source and the destination IP addresses as customers go through this TCP proxy? And the answer is absolutely yes. So then the server 1 gets the request, and server 1 sees what the request is, and server 1, bless his heart, decides to reply or respond back to Bob. So in this bottom table, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and fill in the blanks regarding what the Then when the NetScaler gets that, it's then going to rewrite the headers for the source and destination, and it's going to send it back to Bob, sourcing it from the VIP. So the source address is going to be 23.1.2.3, and the destination address is going to be Bob's address, or those servers back out to those users. I appreciate you joining me for this nugget. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.